Hey, welcome to our first book reveal for the secret projects that we're revealing this month. If you are completely confused about what this might be, you might want to watch the previous couple of videos on this channel where we talk about it. Regardless, it is time for me to tell you about the first of these secret projects. This is the one that I started writing back in 2020 when I first realized I had a little bit of extra time and was feeling the itch to tell a story, something new. And I wrote this as a gift for my wife. It is very fun. It's a little different for me. The title of it is Tress of the Emerald Sea. It is set in the Cosmere, and I'm just going to launch into a reading about it right now. We'll talk about my inspirations and things like that a little bit later. So this is secret project number 1, Tress of the Emerald Sea. By the way, I should warn you, this is second draft. This will change. I haven't actually looked at this in about a year or so since I gave it to my wife. In the middle of the ocean, there was a girl who lived upon a rock. This was not an ocean like the one you have imagined, nor was the rock like one you have imagined. The girl, however, might be as you imagined, assuming you imagined her as thoughtful, soft-spoken, and overly fond of collecting cups. Men often describe the girl as having the hair the color of wheat. Others would call it the color of flax, or occasionally the color of honey. The girl wondered why men so often used food to describe women's features. There seemed to be a hunger to such men that was best avoided. In her estimation, light brown was sufficiently descriptive, though the hue of her hair was not its most interesting trait. That would be, instead, her hair's unruliness. Each morning, she heroically tamed it with brush and comb, then muzzled it with a ribbon and a tight braid. Yet still, some strands always found a way to escape, and would wave free in the wind, eagerly greeting everyone she passed. The girl had been given the unfortunate name of Glorf upon her birth. Don't judge, it was a family name. But her wild hair earned her the name everyone knew her by, Tress. That moniker was, in Tress's estimation, the most interesting thing about her. Tress had been raised to possess a certain inalienable pragmatism, such as a common failing among those who live on dour, lifeless islands from which they can never escape. When you were greeted each day by a black stone landscape, it influences your perspective on life. The island was shaped vaguely like an old man's crooked finger, emerging from the ocean to point toward the horizon. It was made entirely of barren black saltstone, and was large enough for a fair-sized town and a duke's mansion. Though locals called the island the Rock, its name on maps was Diggin's Point. Nobody remembered who Diggin was anymore, but he obviously had been a clever fellow, for he'd left the Rock soon after naming it and had never returned. In the evenings, Tress would often sit on her porch and sip salty tea from one of her favorite cups, while looking out over the deep green ocean. As the sun set, she'd wonder about the people who visited the Rock in their ships. And yes, I did say the ocean was green. Also, it was not wet. We're getting to that. As I said, none of the Rock's residents were allowed to leave. A king somewhere claimed the island, and he considered it vital for reasons that involved important military phrases like potential resupply, friendly acreage, and potential vacation home. Not that anyone in their right mind would consider the Rock a tourist destination. The black saltstone rubbed off and got into everything. It also made most kinds of agriculture impossible, eventually tainting any soil that moved to the town from off-island. The only food the island grew came from compost vats. While the Rock did have important wells that brought water from a deep aquifer, something that visiting ships required, the equipment that worked the salt mines belched a constant stream of black smoke in the air. In summary, the atmosphere was dismal, the ground wretched, and the views depressing. Oh, and have I mentioned the deadly spores? Diggin's Point lay near the verdant Lunagri. Lunagries, you should know, refer to the place where one of the 12 moons hang in the sky around Tress's planet in oppressively low geosynchronous orbits. In other words, they never move. Big enough to fill a full third of the sky, one of the 12 is always visible no matter where you travel, dominating your view like you had a wart on your eyeball. The locals worship those 12 moons as gods, which we can all agree is far more ridiculous than whatever it is that you worship. However, it's easy to see where the superstition began, considering the spores that the moons dropped upon the land. They'd filter down from the Lunagri, visible from the island some 50 or 60 miles away. That's as close as you ever wanted to get to the Lunagri, a great shimmering fountain of colorful motes, vibrant and exceedingly dangerous. The spores filled the world's oceans, creating vast seas, not of water, but of alien dust. Ships sailed that dust like ships sail water here, and you should not find that so unusual. How many other planets have you visited? Perhaps they all sail in oceans of pollen, and your home is the freakish one. The spores were only dangerous if you got them wet, which is rather a problem considering the number of wet things that leak from human bodies, even when they're healthy. The least bit of water would cause the spores to sprout explosively, and the results could range from uncomfortable to deadly. Breathe in a burst of verdant spores, for example, and your saliva would send vines growing out of your mouth, or, in more interesting cases, into your sinuses and out around your eyes. The sores could be rendered inert by two things, salt or silver. Hence the reason why the locals didn't terribly mind the savory taste of their water or their food. It meant they were safe, and they'd teach their children this ever-important rule: salt and silver halt the killer. An acceptable little poem if you're the sort of barbarian who enjoys slant rhymes. Regardless, with the spores, the smoke, and the salt, one could perhaps see why the king needed a law requiring the population to remain on the rock. The place was so inhospitable, even the smog found it depressing. Ships visited periodically to do repairs, drop off waste for the compost vats, and take on new water. But each strictly obeyed the king's rules. No locals were to be taken off of Diggins Point. Ever. And so, Tress would sit on her steps in the evenings, watching the ships sail toward the horizon. A column of spores would drop from the Lunagri, and the sun would move out from behind the moon and creep toward the horizon. She'd sip salty tea from a cup with horses painted on it, and she'd think to herself, "There's a beauty in this, actually. I like it here, and I think I shall be fine to remain here all of my life." Chapter 2, The Groundskeeper. Perhaps you were surprised to hear those last words. Tress wanted to stay on the rock. She liked it there. Where was her sense of adventure, her yearning for new lands, her wanderlust? Well, this isn't the part of the story where you ask questions, so kindly keep them inside. That said, you must understand that this story is about people who are both what they seem and not what they seem, simultaneously. A story of contradictions. Or in other words, it is a story about human beings. In this case, Tress wasn't your ordinary heroine, in that she was actually quite ordinary. In fact, Tress considered herself to be categorically boring. She liked her tea lukewarm. She went to bed on time. She loved her parents, occasionally squabbled with her little brother, and didn't litter. She was fair at needlepoint and had a talent for baking, but had no other noteworthy skills. She didn't train at fencing in secret. She couldn't talk to animals. She had no hidden royalty or deities in her lineage, though her great-grandmother Glorf had once reportedly waved at the king. That had been from atop the rock while he was sailing past many miles away, so Tress didn't think it counted. In short, Tress was just a normal girl. She knew this because the other girls would talk about how they weren't like everyone else. And after a while, Tress figured that the group, everyone else, must include only her. The other girls were so obviously right, as they all knew how to be unique. They were so good at it, in fact, that they do it together. Instead of being fashionable or unique, Tress was pragmatic. She was generally more thoughtful than most people, but didn't like to impose by asking for what she wanted. She'd remain quiet when the other girls were laughing or telling jokes about her. After all, they seemed to be having so much fun. It would be unpolite to spoil that, and presumptive of her to request that they stop. So she just listened, and sometimes the more boisterous youths talked of adventures in far-off oceans. Tress found those ideas frightening. How could she leave her parents and brother? Besides, she had her cup collection to bring adventures to her. Tress cherished her cups. As she grew into her teenage years, she began to collect ones from all across the 12 oceans, far-off lands where the spores were reportedly crimson, azure, or even golden. She had fine porcelain cups with painted glaze, some clay cups that felt rough between her fingers, and even wooden cups that looked rugged and well-used. She loved them all because of the way they brought the world to her. Whenever she sipped from one of the cups, she imagined she could taste far-off foods and drinks. In this, she thought she could understand the people who had crafted them. Several of the sailors who frequently docked at Diggins Point knew of her fondness, and they sometimes brought cups for her. These were often battered and worn, but Tress didn't mind. A cup with a chip or ding in it had a story, and she did love imagining those stories. She'd given the sailors pies in exchange for their gifts, the ingredients purchased with the pittance she earned scrubbing windows. Each time Tress acquired a new cup, she brought it to Charlie to show it off. Charlie claimed to be the groundskeeper at the Duke's mansion at the top of the rock, but Tress knew he was actually the Duke's son. You didn't have to be pragmatic or thoughtful to realize that. Charlie's hands were soft like a child's rather than calloused, and he was better fed than anyone else in town. His hair was always cut neatly, and though he took his signet ring off when he saw her, it left a slightly lighter patch of skin, making it clear he often wore one on the finger that marked a member of the nobility. Besides, Tress wasn't certain what grounds Charlie thought he was keeping. The mansion was, after all, on the rock. There had been a tree on the property once, but it had done the sensible thing and died a few years back. There were some potted plants, though, and that let him pretend. Gray motes swirled in the wind by her feet as she climbed the path up to the mansion. Gray ones were dead. Even the air around the rock was salty enough to kill spores. But she still held her breath as she hurried past. She turned left at the fork, the right one went to the mines, then wove up the switchbacks to the overhang. Here the mansion squatted like a corpulent frog atop its lily. Tress wasn't certain why the Dukes liked it up here. They were closer to the smog, so maybe they liked the similarly tempered company. Climbing all this way was difficult, but considering how the Duke's family fit their clothing, perhaps they figured they could use the exercise. 5 soldiers watched the grounds, though only Snaku and Led were on duty now. They did their jobs well. After all, it had been a horribly long time since anyone of the Duke's family had died from the myriad of dangers a nobleman faced while living on the rock. Those included boredom, stub toes, and choking on cobbler. She'd brought the soldiers pies, of course. As they ate, she considered showing the 2 men her new cup. It was made completely of tin, stamped with letters in a language that ran from up to down instead of left to right. But no, she didn't want to bother them. They let her pass, even though it wasn't her day to wash the mansion's windows. She found Charlie around back, practicing with his fencing sword. When he saw her, he put it down and hurriedly took off his signet ring. "Tress," he said, "I thought you wouldn't be by today." Having just turned 17, Charlie was 2 months older than she was. He had an abundance of smiles, and she had identified each one. For instance, the wide-toothed one he gave her now said he was genuinely happy to have an excuse to be done with fencing practice. He wasn't as fond of it as his father thought he should be. "Swordplay, Charlie?" she asked. "Is that a gardener's task?" He picked up the thin dueling sword. "This? Oh, but it is for gardening." He took a half-hearted swipe at one of the potted plants on the patio. The plant wasn't quite dead yet, but the leaf Charlie split certainly wasn't going to improve its chances. "Gardening," Tress said, "with a sword." "It's how they do things on the Royal Island," Charlie said. He swiped again. "There's always war there, you know. Even their gardeners have to go about armed for protection. So if you consider, it's natural they'd learn to trim plants with a sword. Don't want to get ambushed while you're unarmed." He wasn't a particularly good liar, but that was part of what Tress liked about him. Charlie was genuine. He even lied in an authentic way. And considering how bad he was at making them, the lies couldn't really be held against him. They were so obvious, they were better than many people's truths. He swiped again in the vague direction of the plant, then looked at her and cocked an eyebrow. She shook her head. So he gave her his, "You've caught me, but I can't admit it" grin, and rammed his sword into the dirt of the pot, then plopped down on the low garden wall. The sons of dukes were not supposed to plop. One might therefore consider Charlie to have been a young man of extraordinary talents. Tress settled in next to him, basket in her lap. "What did you bring me?" he said. She took out a small meat pie. "Pigeon," she said, "and carrots, with thyme-seasoned gravy." "A noble combination," she said. "I think the Duke's son, if he were here, would disagree." "The Duke's son is only allowed to eat dishes that have some weird foreign accents over their letters," Charlie said. "And he's never allowed to stop sword practice to eat. So it is fortunate that I am not him." Charlie took a bite. She watched for the smile, and there it was, the smile of delight. She had spent an entire day in thought, considering what she could make with the ingredients that had been on sale at the port market. "So," he said, "what else did you bring?" "Charlie the gardener," she said. "You have just received a very free meat pie, and now you assume to ask for more?" "Assume," he said around a mouthful of pie. He poked her basket with his free hand. "I know there's more. Out with it." She grinned. To most, she didn't impose, but Charlie was different. She revealed the tin cup. "Ah," Charlie said, then put aside the pie and took the cup reverently in 2 hands. Now this is special. Do you know anything about that writing, she asked. It's old Iriali, he said. They vanished, you know. The entire people, poof. Away they went, gone one day, their island left uninhabited. Now, that was 300 years ago, so nobody alive has ever met one of them, but they supposedly had golden hair, like yours, the color of sunlight. My hair is not the color of sunlight, Charlie. Your hair is the color of sunlight if sunlight were light brown, Charlie said. It might be said he had a way with words, and that his words often got away. I'd wager this cup has quite the history, he said. Forged for an Iriali nobleman the day before he and his people were taken by the gods. The cup was left on the table to be collected by the poor fisherwoman who first arrived on the island and discovered the horror of an entire people gone. She passed the cup down to her grandson, who became a pirate, a dead runner even. He eventually buried his ill-gotten treasure deep beneath the spores, only to be recovered now, after eons of darkness, to find its way into your hands. He held the cup up to catch the light. Tress washed the mansion windows and had heard Charlie's parents speaking to him. They berated him for talking so much. They thought it was silly and unbecoming of his station. They rarely let him finish. While, yes, he did ramble sometimes, she'd come to understand there was a reason why. It was because Charlie liked stories, like Tress liked cups. Thank you, Charlie, she whispered. For what? For giving me what I want. He always knew what she meant. It wasn't cups or stories. Always, he said, placing his hand on hers. Always what you want, Tress. And you can always tell me what it is. I know you don't usually do that to others. A shout sounded from deep within the mansion. It was Charlie's father, grousing. So far as she'd been able to tell, yelling at things was the Duke's one and only job on the island, and he took it very seriously. Charlie glanced at the sounds and grew tense, his smile unfortunately fading. But when the sounds didn't draw near, he looked back at the cup. The moment was gone, but another took its place, as they tend to do. Not as intimate, but still valuable, because it was time with him. I like, he said softly, that you listen. Thank you, Tress. I'm fond of your stories, she said, taking the cup and turning it over. Do you think any of that is true? It could be, Charlie said. That's the great thing about stories. But look here, this writing says it once did belong to a king, and his name is right here. And you learned that language in gardening school, he said, in case we had to read the warnings on packages of dangerous plants? Like how you wear a lord's doublet and hose. Because it makes me an excellent decoy, should assassins arrive and try to kill the Duke's son. As you've said. But why then do you take off your ring? Ah, he looked at his hand that met her eyes. Well, I guess I'd rather you not mistake me for someone else. Someone I don't want to have to be. He smiled then, his timid smile. His please go with me on this Tress smile. Because the son of a duke could not openly fraternize with a girl who washed the windows. A nobleman, pretending to be a commoner, though, feigning low station so you could visit with the people of the realm and learn about them. Why, that was expected. It happened in so many stories, it was practically an institution. That makes, she said, perfect sense. Now then, he said, going back to his pie, tell me about your day. I must hear about it. I went browsing through the market for ingredients, she said, tucking a lock of her hair behind her ear. I purchased a pound of fish that Poloni thought was going bad, but it was actually the fish in the next barrel, so I got my fish for a steal. Fascinating, he said. They just let you walk around. Nobody throws a fit when you visit. They don't call their children out to make you shake their hands. Tell me more. Please, I want to know how you realized the fish wasn't bad. With his prodding, she continued elucidating the mundane details of a boring life. He forced her to do it every time she visited. He, in turn, paid attention. That was the proof that his fondness for talking wasn't a failing. He was equally good at listening, at least to her. Indeed, Charlie found her life interesting for some unfathomable reason. As she talked, Tress felt warm. She often did when she visited, because she climbed up high, and it was close to the sun, so it was warmer up here, obviously. Except at that moment, it was moon shadow, and the sun hid behind the moon, and everything grew a few degrees colder. Today, she was feeling tired of a certain lie she told herself. Perhaps there was another reason she felt warm. It was there in Charlie's smile, and she knew it would be in her own as well. He didn't listen only because he was fascinated by the lives of peasants. She didn't come to visit only because she wanted to hear him tell stories. In fact, on the deepest level, it wasn't about cups or stories at all. It was, instead, about gloves. Chapter 3, The Duke. Tress had noticed that a nice pair of gloves made her daily work go so much better. Now, She meant the good kind of gloves, made of soft leather that molded to your hands as you used them. The kind that, if you oiled them well and didn't leave them out in the sun, didn't ever grow stiff. The kind that were so comfortable, you went to wash your hands and were surprised to find you were still wearing them. The perfect set of gloves was invaluable, and Charlie was like a good set of gloves. The longer she spent with him, the more right their time together felt. The brighter even the moon shadows seemed, and the easier her burdens felt. She did love interesting cups, but a part of that was because each one gave her an excuse to come and visit him. The thing growing between them felt so good, so wonderful, that Tress was frightened to call it love. From the way the other youths talked, love was dangerous. Their love seemed to be about jealousy and insecurity. It was about passionate shouting matches and even more passionate reconciliations. It seemed less like a good pair of gloves and more like a hot coal that would burn your hands. Love had always frightened Tress, but when Charlie again put his hand on hers, she felt that heat. The fire she'd always feared. The coal was in there, after all, just contained, like in a good stove. She wanted to leap into his heat, all logic discarded. Charlie froze, his hand on hers. They touched many times before, of course, but this was different, this moment, this dream. He blushed, but let his hand linger. Then he finally took it back and ran it through his hair, grinning sheepishly. Of course, because he was himself, that didn't spoil the moment, but instead made it more sweet. Tress searched for the perfect thing to say. There were any number of lines that would have capitalized on the moment. She could have said, "Charlie, could you hold this for me while I walk around the grounds?" Then offered her hand back to him. She could have said, "Help, I can't breathe. Staring at you has taken my breath away." She could have even said something completely insane, such as, "I like you." Instead, she said, "Hands are warm." She followed it with a laugh that she choked on halfway through, exactly mimicking, by pure chance, the call of an elephant seal. It might be said that Tress had a way with words, and that her words tended to get in the way. In response, Charlie gave her a smile. A wonderful smile, more and more confident the longer it lasted. It was one she'd never seen before, and it said, "I think I love you, Tress, elephant seal notwithstanding." She smiled back at him. Then over his shoulder, she saw the Duke standing in the window just behind. Tall and straight, the man wore military-style clothing that looked like it had been pinned on him by the various medals on the breast. He was not smiling. Indeed, she'd only seen him smile once during the punishment of old Lottery, who had supposedly tried to sneak off the island by stowing away on a merchant ship. It seemed that it was the Duke's only smile. Perhaps Charlie had used the entire family's quota. Nevertheless, if the Duke did have only one smile, he made up for it by somehow displaying far too many teeth. That day, the Duke faded into the shadows of the house, but he seemed to be looming over Tress as she bid farewell to Charlie. On her way down the steps, she expected to hear shouting between them. Instead, the mansion was silent, though it was an ominous kind of silence, the tense silence that came after you saw a lightning flash. It chased her down the path and down the steps around to her home, where she murmured something to her parents about being tired. She went to her room and there waited for the silence to end, for the soldiers to knock to demand to know why the girl who watched the windows had dared to touch the Duke's son. When nothing like that came, she dared hope that she was reading too much into the Duke's expression. Then she remembered his singular smile. After that, worries nipped at her all night. She finally rose early in the morning, rustled her hair into a tail, then trudged to the market. Here, she'd sort through the day-old goods and near-spoiled ingredients for something she could afford. Despite the early hour, however, the market was abuzz with activity. Men swept dead spores off their path while women gathered in chattering knots. Tress knew instantly there was news. She braced herself, deciding nothing could be worse than the awful anticipation she suffered all night. She was wrong. The Duke had said a declaration. He and his family were going to leave the island that very day. Chapter 4, The Sun. Leave? Leave the island? People didn't leave the island. Tress knew logically that wasn't explicitly true. The Duke left on occasion to report to the king. Plus, he'd earned all those fancy medals by killing people from a distant place where they looked slightly different. He'd apparently been very heroic during those wars. You could tell because a great number of his troops had died while he had lived. In the past, the Duke had never taken his family. This time, though, they were going. The ducal heir has come of age, the proclamation announced, and so we shall be presenting him for betrothal to the various princesses of the civilized seas. Now, Tress was a pragmatic woman, and so she only thought about ripping her shopping basket to shreds in frustration. She merely deliberated whether it would be appropriate to swear at the top of her lungs. She barely considered marching up to the Duke's mansion to demand he change his mind. Instead of these very impractical responses, she went about her shopping in a numb haze, using the familiar action to give her suddenly crumbling life a semblance of normalcy. She found some garlic she was certain she could salvage, several potatoes that hadn't withered too badly, and even some grain where the weevils were large enough to pick out. Once she'd have been pleased with this haul. Today she couldn't think of anything but Charlie. It seemed so incredibly unfair. She had only just acknowledged what she felt for him, and everything was already turning upside down. Yes, she'd been told to expect this pain. Love involved pain. But that was the salt in your tea. Wasn't there also supposed to be a dab of honey? Wasn't there supposed to be, dared she wish, passion? She was to receive all the detriments of a romantic affair with none of the advantages. Unfortunately, her practicality began to assert itself. So long as the two of them had been able to pretend, then the real world hadn't been able to claim them. But the days of pretend were over. What had she thought was going to happen? That the Duke would let her marry his son? What did she think she could offer someone like Charlie? She was nothing when compared to a princess. I mean, think of how many cups they could afford. In the pretend world, marriage was about love. In the real world, it was about politics, a word laden with a very large number of meanings, most of them boiling down to, this is a matter for nobles and begrudgingly the very rich to discuss, not peasants. She finished her shopping and started up the path toward her home, where at least she could commiserate with her parents. Unfortunately, it seemed that the Duke was wasting no time, for she saw a procession snaking down toward the docks. She turned around and walked back, arriving just after the procession, which began to load the family's things onto a merchant ship. Nobody was allowed to leave the island, unless they were instead somebody. Tress worried she wouldn't get a chance to speak with Charlie. Then she worried that she would, but he wouldn't want to see her. Mercifully, she caught him standing at the side of the crowd, searching out through the gathered people. The moment he spotted her, he immediately rushed over. Tress, oh moons, I worried I wouldn't find you in time. What did she say? Fair maiden, he said, bowing, I must take my leave. Charlie, she said softly, don't try to be someone you aren't. I know you. He grimaced. He was wearing a traveling coat and even a hat. He hated hats. Tress, he said softer, I'm afraid I've lied to you. You see, I'm not the groundskeeper. I'm the Duke's son. Amazing. Who would have thought that Charlie the gardener and Charles the Duke's heir would be the same person, considering they're the same age, look the same, and wear the same clothing? Yes. Are you angry at me? Anger is in line right now, Tress said. It's seventh down, sandwiched between confusion and fatigue. Behind, Charlie's father and mother marched up onto the ship. Their servants followed with the last of the baggage. Charlie looked down at his feet. It seems I'm to be married to a princess of some nation or another. What do you think of that? What should she say? I wish you well. He looked up and met her eyes. Always Tress, remember? It was hard for her, but she found the words, hiding in the corner and trying to avoid her. It was hard for her, but she found the words hiding in the corner, trying to hide from her. I wish, she said, seizing hold of them, that you wouldn't do that you wouldn't get married to someone else. Oh, he looked up. Do you really? I mean, I'm sure they are very nice, the princesses. I believe it is part of the job description, Charlie said. Like, have you heard the things they do in stories? Resuscitate amphibians? Notice for people that their children have wet the bed? One would have to be rather kindly to do those services. Yes, Tress said. She took a deep breath. I would still rather you didn't marry one of them. Well, then I shan't, Charlie said. I don't believe you have a choice, Charlie. Your father wants you married. It's politics. But you see, I have a secret weapon. He took her hands and leaned in. Behind, his father moved up to the prow of the ship and looked down, scowling. Charlie, however, smiled a lopsided smile, his, look how sneaky I am, smile. He used it when he wasn't being very sneaky. What kind of weapon, Charlie? She asked. I can be incredibly boring. That's not a weapon. It might not be one in war, Tress, but in courtship, it's as fine a weapon as the sharpest rapier. You know how I go on, and on, and on. I like how you go on, Charlie. I don't mind the on either. Sometimes I even enjoy the on. You are a very special case, Charlie said. This is kind of silly, but you're like a pair of gloves, Tress. I am? She said, choking up. Yes, no, don't be offended. I mean, when I have to practice the sword, I wear these gloves and... I understand, she whispered. From atop the ship, Charlie's father scowled again, then shouted for him to be quick. Tress realized that, like Charlie had different kinds of smiles, his father had different kinds of scowls. She didn't much like what this one implied about her. Charlie glanced up at his father, then squeezed her hands, looking back at Tress. Listen, Tress, I promise you, I'm not going to get married. I'm going to go to those kingdoms, and I'm going to be so insufferably boring that none of the girls will have me. I'm not good at much. I've never scored even a single point against my father in sparring. I spill my soup at formal dinners. I talk so much, even my footman, who is paid to listen, comes up with creative reasons to interrupt me. The other day, I was telling him about the story of the fish and the whale, and he pretended to stub his toe end. The Duke shouted again. I can do this, Tress, Charlie insisted. I will do this. At each stop, I'll pick a cup for you, all right? Once I've bored the current princess to death, and my father has decided we need to move on, I'll send you the cup. As proof, you see. He squeezed her hands. I'll do it, not just because you listen, because you know me, Tress. You've always been able to see me when others don't. He squeezed her hands one last time, then moved to finally respond to his father's shouting. Tress held on, clinging to his hands, unwilling to let it end. Charlie looked back, giving her one last smile. And though he obviously tried to be confident, she knew his smiles. This was his uncertain one, his hopeful but worried one. You are my gloves too, Charlie, Tress said to him. After that, she let go and let him jog up the plate. She'd imposed enough already. The Duke forced his son below deck. The ship pushed back, sailing off the dead gray spores nearest the rock into the true spore ocean. This began to shake and vibrate as the vents deep below on the ocean floor began to send up bursts of air. With this agitation, the spores became as liquid. Wind caught the ship's sails, and it struck out toward the horizon, leaving a wake of disturbed emerald dust behind it. Tress climbed up to her house, then watched from the cliff until the ship was the size of a cup, then the size of a speck, then it vanished. After that, the waiting began. They say that to wait is the most excruciating of life's torments. They, in this case, refers to writers who have nothing useful to do. So they fill their time thinking of things to say. Any working person can tell you that having to wait is a luxury. Tress had windows to watch, meals to cook, a little brother to watch. Her father never had recovered from his accident in the mines. Though he tried to help, he could barely walk. He helped Tress's mother sew socks all day, which they sold to sailors. But with the expensive yarn, they turned only a meager profit. So Tress didn't wait. She worked. Still, it was an enormous relief when the first cup arrived. It was delivered by Hoyd, the cabin boy. Yes, that's me. What tipped you off? Was it perhaps the name? A beautiful porcelain cup, without even a single chip in it. It came with a letter and a card and a little drawing, two gloved hands holding one to another. The world brightened that day. Tress could almost imagine Charlie speaking as she read the letter, which detailed the affections of the first princess. With heroic monotony, he had listed the sounds his stomach made when he laid in various positions at night. As that hadn't been quite enough, he'd apparently explained how he kept his toenail clippings and gave them names. That had done it. Fight on, my loquacious love, Tress thought as she scrubbed the mansion windows the next day, thinking of those words. Be brave, my mildly gross warrior. The second cup was made of pure red glass, tall and thin, like it was meant to appear as if it contained more liquid than it did. Perhaps it was from a particularly stingy tavern. To this princess, he'd explained what he'd had for breakfast, using intricate detail, as he'd apparently counted the pieces of scrambled egg and had categorized them by size. The third cup was a good, solid pewter mug with a heft to it. Perhaps it was from one of those places Charlie had made up, where people always needed to carry weapons. Tress was reasonably certain she could knock out an attacker by swinging this cup. The princess hadn't been able to withstand an extended conversation about the benefits of various punctuation marks, including the ones he'd made up. The fourth package didn't have a letter with it, just a cup that had a painted butterfly on it with a red ocean underneath. She found it odd that the butterfly wasn't terrified of the spores, but maybe it was a prisoner butterfly, being forced to fly out over the ocean to its doom. The fifth cup never arrived. Tress tried to play it off, telling herself that it must have been interrupted in transit. After all, any number of dangerous things could happen to a sailing ship on the spores. Pirates, or, spores. But the months stretched long, each more tedious than the one before. Every time a ship arrived at the docks, Tress was there, asking for the mail. Nothing. She did this for months on end, until an entire year had passed since Charlie had left. And then, finally, a note. Not from Charlie, but from his father. Sent to the entire town, not just individually to her. The Duke was returning to Diggins Point at long last, and he was bringing his wife, his heir, and his new daughter-in-law. Chapter 5. The Bride. Tress sat on her porch, leaning against her mother, watching the horizon. She held the last cup that Charlie had sent, the one with the suicidal butterfly. It wasn't very practical, she whispered to her mother. Love rarely is, her mother replied. She was a stout woman with a cheerful kind of girth. 5 years ago, she'd been as thin as reeds. Then Tress had learned her mother was giving up a portion of her food to her children. From then on, Tress had taken over shopping and made their money stretch further. A ship appeared on the horizon. I finally thought of what I should have said. Tress pushed her hair out of her eyes. When he left, I called him a glove. It isn't so bad as it sounds. He had just called me one, you see. I've had a year to think about it, and I realized I could have said something more. Her mother squeezed her shoulder as the ship drew inevitably closer. I should, Tress whispered, have said that I loved him. Her mother joined her as she marched, like a soldier on the front lines facing cannon fire, down to the docks to greet the ship. Her father, with his bad leg, stayed behind, which was good. Tress feared he'd make a scene from how he'd been grumbling about the Duke and his son over the last few months. But Tress could not find it in herself to blame Charlie. It wasn't his fault that he was the Duke's son. It could have happened to anyone, really. A crowd had gathered. The Duke's letter said he wanted a celebration, and he was bringing food and wine. Whatever else the people thought of getting a new future Duchess, they were not going to miss a chance at free alcohol. As it's ever been, gifts are the secret to popularity. That, and having the power to behead anyone who dislikes you. Tress and her mother arrived at the back of the crowd, but Holmes, the baker, waved them up on his steps so they could see better. He was a kind man, always saving the ends of used loaves, then selling them to her for pennies. So it was that Tress had a good view of the princess as she appeared on the deck. She was beautiful. Rosy cheeks, shimmering hair, delicate features. She was so perfect, the finest painter in the seas couldn't have made improvements by doing a portrait. Charlie had finally gotten to be part of a story. With effort, Tress was happy for him. The Duke appeared next, waving his hand so the people knew to cheer for him. I present, he shouted, my heir. A young man stepped onto the deck beside the princess, and it was most definitely not Charlie. This young man was around the same age as Charlie, but he was 6.5 feet tall and had a jaw so straight it made other men question if they were. He bulged with muscles, to the point that when he lifted his arm to wave, Tress swore she could hear seams on his shirt begging for mercy. What under the 12 moons? After an unfortunate accident, the Duke proclaimed to the hushed crowd, I was forced to adopt my nephew Dirk and appoint him as my new heir. He gave a moment for the crowd to take that in. He's an excellent fencer, the king continued, and responds to questions with single-sentence answers, sometimes only using one word. Also, he's a war hero. He lost 10,000 men in the Battle of Lake Privy. 10,000, Tress's mother said. My, that's a lot. We shall now celebrate Dirk's marriage to the Princess of Dormancy, the Duke shouted, raising his hands high. The crowd was quiet, still confused. I brought 30 kegs, the Duke shouted. They cheered, and so a party it was. The townspeople led the way up to the meeting hall. They remarked about the princess's beauty and marveled that Dirk managed to balance so well while walking, considering his center of gravity must have been located somewhere around his upper sternum. Tress's mother said she'd get answers and followed after. However, when Tress came out of her shock, she found Flick, one of the servants, waving for her near the bottom of the gangplank. He was a kindly man, though he had wide ears that looked as if they were waiting for just the right moment to bolt and fly away, taking to the skies to be with their kind. Flick, she whispered. What happened? An accident? Where's Charlie? Flick glanced up at the train of people walking to the feast hall. The Duke and his family had joined them, and were far enough now that any scowls would lose potency due to wind resistance and gravitational drop. He wanted me to give you this, Flick said, handing her a small sack. It tinkled as she took it. Inside were broken pieces of ceramic. The 5th cup. He tried so hard, Miss Tress, Flick whispered. Oh, you should have seen the young master. He did everything he could to put those women off. He memorized 87 different types of plywood and their uses. He told every princess he met at length about his childhood pets. He even talked about religion. I thought they had him at the 5th kingdom, as that princess was deaf, but the young master went and threw up on her at dinner. He threw up? Right in her lap, Miss Tress. Flick looked both ways, then waved for her to follow as he made to carry some luggage off the docks, getting them to a more secluded location. But his father got wise, Miss Tress, figured out what the young master was doing. The Duke got right mad indeed. He gestured to the broken cup she was carrying in her sack. Yes, but what happened to Charlie? Tress asked. Flick looked away. Please, Tress asked. Where is he? He sailed the midnight sea, Miss Tress, he said. Beneath the Nasamia's own moon. The sorceress took him. Those names sent a chill through Tress. The midnight sea, the domain of the sorceress? Why would he ever do such a thing? Well, I think it's because his father forced him to, Flick said. The sorceress isn't married, you know, and the king had long wanted to make her less of a threat, so... He sent Charlie to try to marry the sorceress? Flick didn't respond. No, Tress said. He sent Charlie to die. I didn't say anything like that, Flick said, hurrying off. If anyone asks, I didn't say anything like that. Numb, Tress sat down on the dock pillars. She listened to the spores stirring, a sound like pouring sand. Even for an out-of-the-way island like hers, they knew the sorceress. She periodically sent ships to raid the borders of the Verdant Sea, and it was incredibly difficult to fight her. Her stronghold lay somewhere in the remote Midnight Sea, the most dangerous of them all. And to get to it, you had to cross the Crimson Sea, an unpopulated sea that was only slightly less deadly. Finding out Charlie had been taken by her was basically like finding him had taken up to one of the moons. Tress couldn't trust just one man's word, not on something like this. She didn't dare bother others with questions, but she listened as they talked in hushed tones to inquisitive dock workers, eager to get the ship unloaded so they could go join the party. They all got similar answers. Yes, Charlie had been sent to the Midnight Sea. Yes, the king knew. The Duke and he had been together when the decision had been made. Well, certainly it must make sense if the king had thought of it. Someone had to try to stop the sorceress from raiding, and Charlie, of all people, was the obvious choice for reasons. The implications horrified Tress. The Duke and the king had realized Charlie was being difficult, and their solution had been to simply get rid of him. Dirk had been instated as heir within hours of word that Charlie's ship had vanished. In the eyes of the nobles, this was an elegant result. The Duke got an heir he could finally be proud of. The king got an advantageous marriage alliance in Dirk's bride from another kingdom. And everyone got to blame another death on the sorceress, building public opinion toward another war. After 3 days, Tress finally dared impose upon Brunswick, the Duke's steward, with a begged plea for more information. As he liked her pies, he admitted that they'd received a ransom letter from the sorceress, but the Duke, in his wisdom, had declared it to be a trick to lure more ships into the Sea of Night. The king had declared Charlie officially dead. Days passed. Tress lived them in a daze, realizing nobody cared. They called it politics and moved on. Though the new heir had the intellect of a soggy piece of bread, he was popular, handsome, and very good with swords. While Charlie had been, well, Charlie. Tress spent weeks gathering her courage, then went to ask the Duke if he'd please pay the ransom. Such a bold move was difficult for her. She wasn't a coward by any definition of the word, but imposing on people, well, it just wasn't something she did. But with her parents' encouragement, she made the long trek and quietly made her request. The Duke, in turn, called her a caramel-haired strumpet and forbid her from washing windows anywhere in town. She was forced to begin making socks with her parents for a greatly reduced pay. As the weeks passed, Tress fell into lethargy. She felt less a human being and more like a human who was just being. Life on the rock for everyone else returned to normal, easy as that. Nobody cared. Nobody was going to do anything. Until it was 2 months after the Duke's return, Tress made her decision. There was somebody who cared. Naturally, it would be up to that person to do something. Tress couldn't impose on anyone else. She was going to have to go rescue Charlie herself. So there we go. Tress of the Emerald Sea, Book 1. As you can probably tell, this is a story being told in the Cosmere by a certain somebody to other people. That maybe might explain to you the slightly more fairy tale-ish feel of it. It is actually a canon story. These events did happen. He's just describing them in his own special way. So this is the first book. That is part 1 of the book, the first 5 chapters. It has, I think, 5 parts. So this is a nice little chunk of the story. I hope that you enjoyed it. The Kickstarter is live now. You can get a copy of this and the 3 other secret projects, and I will be back each week this month on Thursdays. Is that right, Adam? On Thursdays to give you a new reading from a different book from this thing, and they are all very different from one another. So I hope that you enjoyed that, and I hope that you'll check out our Kickstarter, and I will be back on Tuesday of next week to do a live stream. We'll answer some Q&A about this, and I think that's when I'll talk about my inspirations and why I decided to write this and those sorts of things. So please join us at the live stream on Tuesday, and be back next week for a new story.